When Paris sneezes, Europe catches a cold. Clemens von Metternich. Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849. But by iron and blood. Otto von Bismarck, in a speech delivered to the Prussian representatives in 1862. The statesman's task is to hear God's footsteps marching through history and to try and catch on to his coattails as he marches past. Also Bismarck. In 1848, revolutions erupted across Europe, and monarchs who had been installed after the reinstatement of the conservative order following the Congress of Vienna were swept aside. Republics, mostly lasting no more than a few months, sprang up in their place, demanding an end to the bread queues, and that the people be given a platform to participate in politics as equal citizens of a defined national community. For at this stage in the 19th century, nationalism and liberalism were two sides of the same coin. Notwithstanding the universal rising of nations, the working men who, according to Karl Marx, had no country, for the first time played an active role in the revolutions, which had a complex and contradictory class character. Not merely the abolition of monarchy was desired, but the installation of a social republic with guaranteed workers' rights and, in Paris, even the right to work. In other words, full employment. Ultimately, the demands of the workers went unfulfilled as the moderates betrayed them by siding with the conservatives, when their ideas began to threaten the interests of the propertied classes. Thus, virtually all the new governments fell soon after they had been established and were replaced with autocrats now prepared to pay lip service to democracy by allowing free elections, while maintaining a tight grip on the apparatus of the state. Britain underwent no such tumult or political shake-up. The common man was not stirred by mobilizing nationalism, nor domestic famine during the so-called Hungry Forties. Instead, ordinary people signed petitions demanding a greater say on how they were governed in what was known as the Chartist movement. Trade unionism, an ideology based around winning concessions from one's employer by taking collective action, without fundamentally challenging the master's overlordship of his servants, was the dominant form of political participation for workers in Britain. The Chartists' plea was couched in moralist terms and entreated the ruling class to search their souls and discover the common humanity it shared with the masses. National consciousness in Britain was shaped in opposition to the continent by the idea that revolution was not the done thing. Here, we settle our differences by reform. The Chartists were, unsurprisingly, unsuccessful, much like the modern-day Change.org petitions, and the unions won only localized success, benefiting mainly skilled workers. Modest changes in law expanded the franchise somewhat over the following decades, and unions were absorbed into the social fabric by the Trade Union Act in 1871. Russia also had no 1848 revolution, but for quite different reasons. Russian nationalism was not a political force, and pan-Slavism among the intelligentsia only took off further into the century. Most importantly, repression was the order of the day. The Tsar ruled as a divinely invested autocrat from whose power the landlord derived his. The peasant-serf majority, being tied to the soil on which they were born, and obliged to donate their labour to him. Russia's industrialization lagged far behind the rest of Europe, and the country remained overwhelmingly rural. Only in 1861 was serfdom abolished by Alexander II. France had the only medium-term successful revolution of 1848. After Napoleon's defeat in 1815, the Bourbon monarchy was restored, and Louis XVIII took the throne. His successor, Charles X, was overthrown in the 1830 revolution, dramatized in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Louis Philippe, the so-called citizen king, was then installed in a period of constitutional monarchy. It was he who was ousted in the Revolution of February 1848, inaugurating a second French Republic. Industrial workers brought in the concept of the right to work and created national workshops to facilitate full employment. Street battles ensued in the summer, where conservatives, demanding order after what they saw as political chaos brought on by the overthrow of the king, fought republicans and socialists. The moderate republicans grew anxious of what the workers' policies would mean for their property interests and switched sides, dooming their short-lived socialist gains and assisting authoritarianism from above. Although free elections were held later in the year, a conservative peasantry helped to elect Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, as president. 3 years later, he staged a coup to stay in power and declared himself Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, in 1852. He remained so until 1871. There was no German nation-state in 1848. No national focal point, like Paris was for France. Instead, revolutions broke out across the various states of the German Confederation from March, where liberal nationalists challenged Habsburg dominance under the black, red and gold tricolour, Germany's modern flag. The revolutionaries convened in the new parliament at Frankfurt and drew up a constitution, inviting Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia to take the title of German Emperor. He refused the offer, rejecting what he saw as a crown from the gutter that the representatives did not have the authority to bestow. German unification was to be postponed until 1871. It was to be achieved piecemeal during the minister presidency of Otto von Bismarck, who assessed the failure of 1848 as demonstrating a lack of realism and pragmatism. Bismarck was a politician willing to do anything to achieve his aims. He unconstitutionally expanded the military, declared war for the German-speaking territories in Denmark, stirred up conflict with Austria, and ultimately provoked a confrontation with France that would lead to a Second Reich being declared in the halls of Versailles. Ironically, precisely where it all came crashing down after the First World War.